Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Rebecca Ruth Gould, author of Erasing Palestine, Free Speech and Palestinian Freedom, and Writers and Rebels, The Literature of Insurgency in the Caucasus, among many other books. She is a distinguished professor of comparative poetics and global politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. On Substack, she can be found at The Textual Materialist. I welcome Rebecca Ruth Gould to Savage Minds. Aside from the articles you've written for Savage Minds, which are excellent, I've also read Way Beyond. And your book, Erasing Palestine, touches upon the issue of free speech and the genocide in Gaza, but it goes back even much further in history to tell the story of anti-Semitism in Britain since the 20th century and how the country's internal politics have fed into this over the past several years, and the deeper entrenchment of each side in the current debate over Gaza, those who refuse to see genocide and those looking firmly at the grim facts on the ground. What strikes me about your book are some of the themes that we're seeing today, such as the IHRA definition critique, where you give a critical analysis of the definition, arguing that its application has led to a, quote, simplistic definitional logic that focuses uniquely on specific words rather than the substance of racism or political critique, ultimately stifling legitimate debate. And then the erasure of the Palestinian narrative, which we'll get into, the history of anti-Semitism. Your book tells a longer story about this history throughout the 20th century, arguing for a socioeconomic and materialist understanding of anti-Semitism rather than a purely definitional one. And then the free speech advocacy part of your book, which is really the spine of your book, I'd say, where you make the case for the importance of robust free speech and academic freedom as essential prerequisites for the quest for Palestinian freedom and justice. So, could you talk a bit about your book and why today it matters more than ever?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm very proud to be part of an excellent series of guests. I wrote the book. I think it is a combination of a kind of intellectual quest and a personal one. And so it does really have very concrete autobiographical origins in 2017, when I had the distinction of being what I would still believe, based on my research and knowledge, was the first UK-based academic to be targeted through the IHRA definition, because that was a point in history, 2017, when the UK government had actually just a few months earlier adopted the definition. It was among the first countries in the world to adopt it. This definition, maybe I should also, briefly sort of introduce what it is for readers or listeners who may have heard of it, but may not kind of know the history. So it's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. I think it's increasingly a kind of household word right now, certainly for people who follow Palestinian issues and free speech issues. But it has its origins in a kind of attempt during the 1990s and 2010s, 2000s of especially people who were very closely aligned with Israel, trying to develop a new understanding of what anti-Semitism is, because traditionally we have this understanding of anti-Semitism as anti-Jewish hatred, right? But then there was this new idea that I think from the point of view of sort of pro-Israel people, that didn't capture left anti-Semitism, which they saw as being anti-Israel sentiment. And so this definition of anti-Semitism, IHRA definition, which was actually originally sort of justified as a kind of a way of reclassifying hate crimes. So, for example, if someone spray painted a wall with anti-Israel sentiment, how could that? The idea was that police should be seeing that as an anti-Semitic hate crime, and so that was kind of the first way in which it was introduced. But actually, the person Kenneth Stern, who introduced that, eventually called out, spoken out against the abuses now that are taking place of the IHRA definition to silence Israel critical speech. It quickly moved from the realm of kind of criminal law, with which I think it had a kind of odd relationship, to the realm of discourse. And again, began to be applied to sort of, well, in my case, actually, in 2017 in the UK, to an article that I wrote while I was living in Bethlehem. I wrote it actually in 2011, and a student felt that it was anti-Semitic and invoked the IHRA definition to justify his points. He published an op-ed in the school newspaper, the university newspaper, calling out my article, and it was really a surreal experience, because, as I said, that article had been written, before I actually arrived in the UK in 2015 to teach at the University of Bristol. And it was a very short article, 2 pages, not something that was very much on my radar at that time. So it was really like resurrected from the past, and I just never imagined, that it would have that kind of resonance, in the UK. But it did. And what was really interested me was not just the accusations of anti-Semitism, basically for kind of saying the core argument of the article called a race, called what was it called? I forget the title, but it was that it was Israel was manipulating the Holocaust memory to detract from what it was doing in the West Bank. And that's not a particularly controversial argument, but it wasn't obviously an anti-Israel argument. And I was just interested in the way that the definition itself, the IHRA definition, was used against me. And because it was clear, even at that point in 2017, that it had very clear implications, not just for how we think about Israel and Palestine, but how we think about speech in general, and what is the legitimate scope of, say, what can an academic say, and the idea of like defining what can and cannot be said, which is so explicitly embedded in the IHRA definition. All of that was just very kind of new, and that's something I hadn't quite seen free speech suppressed in that way. I'd earlier been I did get my PhD from Columbia University, so I'd seen other kinds of suppression of free speech we could turn to later, but that particular sort of definitional logic did strike me as somewhat new. And I think it just required analysis and discussion, and I think it has really shaped the way in which free speech on Palestine has been persecuted in the decade to follow. So that's kind of the core origin of the book. That's that experience of like coming under fire, having government officials, Eric Pickles, saying that I should consider my position, which is the UK British way of saying that I should be fired, and sort of becoming awakened to the stakes of what I got myself into. That's I guess that's the personal angle, and I guess that at a certain point, that really sparked in me an interest in free speech in general as a kind of principle to live by and to fight for. I would say that it's not been something that was particularly kind of high on my priorities at that point, but really what the reason why it became important to me was because I was confronted with people who felt that, just because I was opposed to apartheid in Israel, just because of my positions, my strongly held convictions, that made me anti-Semitic. At a certain level, I thought, well, there's not that much for me to say. I mean, you can't kind of reason with that point of view. And so I came to the view that really free speech is the only recourse in that situation, for allowing people to kind of have their views. But obviously we're not going to like, hopefully in an ideal world, we're not going to be harming each other. We're just going to allow ourselves to have those views. And so you have to, I think every leftist at the end of the day kind of has to be, I mean, this is a controversial position, but my view is that every leftist has to be, in favor of free speech if they're intellectually consistent. And so, those are kind of some of the interventions I tried to make with the book.
And the working definition of anti-Semitism, we've seen in recent months, even weeks, where this becomes an own goal, such as drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. How many times over the past 6 weeks have I seen Netanyahu do just that in the reverse? You've seen it, right? Where he says, this is not like, I mean, in saying it's not like is exactly saying it is like.
Precisely.
And using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism. What on earth? You know, in Italy, for instance, the Irish cross, what is it called? Oh, I should know the name now. But it's a type of cross. It's prohibited here. And I was really shocked to learn that.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, why? Like, make the leprechaun, I don't know, whatever. And then, no, but it becomes very surreal when you start to see what's going on. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g., by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Now, this is most interesting because the history of Zionism is such that and it's well known, including American Jews back in that Philadelphia conference in the 1890s, were very against it because they themselves saw early on that this had all the hallmarks of racism. How is it that the UK was one of the first countries to adopt this quite moronic definition? And by the way, since you are an American living in the UK, I'm also very interested in something that's interlaced with this question. I'm finding, despite the fact that we have the First Amendment, and I would have thought that the U.S. has a higher number of supporters of this genocide, but recent polls say differently. Recent polls are showing that, in fact, it's these Guardian observer readers who are buttressing the genocide in Gaza spiritually. Why?
Wow. Yeah, I think those are all very true observations. As far as the kind of the distinctiveness of the UK in this, yes, that was also a bit of a shock to me as well. But it does need to be said that, yes, the UK was the first country to adopt the IHRA definition. And actually, I don't even think that the US at a federal level, the United States, despite at a state level having, widely adopted it and being very deeply implicated in the persecution of pro-Palestine activists, at a federal level, the United States has not adopted this definition because it would be ludicrous to do so. There's no way that could be consistent with the First Amendment. And so, yes, the UK has unfortunately played a leading role in censoring pro-Palestine speech. And I think we need to mention in this context also the proscription of Palestine Action, which we could see as kind of like the logical follow-on. Once again, if the IHRA definition essentially criminalizes speech, looks at discourse and applies to it this kind of censorious framework that really, hasn't broadly been done in the past century. I think we could also see the prescription of UK terrorism laws to property damage as something analogous. I mean, it's just a complete overreach of even the most whatever the original intention behind UK terrorism laws were. It was not to prescribe people who spray painted buildings. And so I think there's a logical progression there. There's this kind of tolerance in the UK for very weak, shall I say, formalist or very, very empty and shallow understandings of free speech, unfortunately, because this is also a country that has such a robust tradition of free speech. But yeah, that's definitely the trajectory. And it's, I think, one in terms of my contribution to understanding the IHRA definition, or the IRA definition, as people call it, the working definition, some people call it, although it's really interesting that I think it's ceased to become a quote unquote working definition. It's really been fossilized into this very, it's been, incorporated into law in some places. So that working was a bit of a deceptive, label, I think. In terms of my, I think what I bring to that discussion is that I saw from an early point that, there's a lot of very problematic claims in this definition. It makes them has a very narrow understanding of what anti-Semitism is, of racism. It separates anti-Semitism from other kinds of racism. And so I think it's really important to make that kind of substantive critique. But I would also add that my view is that like whatever you put inside that document, these like it's a document, and then 11 examples, like whatever goes there, it would always be bad because the very idea of trying to develop a definition of racism that focuses just on discourse and then that talks about itself as something that needs to be adopted without even thinking through what does it mean? What does it mean for a state to adopt something? Like, it wasn't that I use this term quasi law to describe it because it's often like treated as if it were actually a law, that but anti-Semitism is not illegal. So it doesn't, in its original formulation, it didn't have legal force, and that's why it was called a working definition. But it's, as we see in practice, I mean, it does have the force of a law in many, many jurisdictions. And I think that, and so I guess what I'm saying is like, even if it was good, it's really important to be clear about what it is we're dealing with. And there's this kind of deception that's built into the very structure of this thing that we're calling the definition of anti-Semitism, that, it's not what it says it is. And I think that's never going to be good for democracy or freedom. So even if it was something I agreed with, I'd still be opposed to it because it's not the structure of it, this kind of making, the what's prohibited to say and what's not into some kind of quasi law that is treated with respect of the law, but hasn't gone through any kind of democratic parliamentary vetting process or anything like that. That's always going to put us in a very dangerous place. And yeah,
it's also mandating Zionism. It's basically
absolutely.
It has very little to do with anti-Semitism. Actually, it's very much about codifying any criticism of Zionism and making that anti-Semitic.
Absolutely. And I think it's really, important to note that would not have worked. Like if they had done that in a democratic way and just like, put out a vote saying, should we criminalize anti-Zionism? That never would have been feasible, to impose that kind of restriction on free speech. So the kind of the maneuvers and the mechanisms that had to be adopted to make this normalization of Zionist discourse have really powerful effect. I think that's really worth attending to. I mean, it's important to note that when the UK adopted the definition, that sounds like a very kind of formal process, right? You would think if for a government to adopt a definition. No, it was just a press release that was basically posted on the website right before Christmas. I think they wanted to do it in a very covert manner, but then interestingly, David Feldman, who's the Birkbeck professor of anti-Semitism, who follows these things very closely, like he was the only person in the media to actually comment on what the government had just done. And he wrote a very, very prescient article a few days after that happened, saying that it was a bad decision. And like no other media was covering this because no one knew what the IJA definition was. And then, a few months later, suddenly, people were targeting not just me, but myself and also a colleague at University of Exeter, Palestinian colleague from Gaza, began to be called anti-Semitic. And the government, very, very gradually, the Minister of Education, again, they hadn't adopted this in any kind of legal context, but they began to write letters to university chancellors saying, I hope you're looking at this document that we've adopted. And it was, it was very subtle, but yeah, so it's not. I think now, as I said, it's been in the United States in particular. There are many contexts in which it is actually legally binding, which is outrageous and being challenged in various places. But I think it's important to look at that process because it tells us a lot about how people are silenced.
I wanted to talk with you about something we communicated via email about. And I had spoken about this book that came out while I was living between New York and Montreal for many years, The Case of Nadia Abu al-Hajj, from about 20 years ago at Columbia University, when she published a book which really set her whole life on fire. I mean, her tenure was put up for question. And this was in the era also of Daniel Pipe's Blacklist. And I was on it. I taught Orientalism. If you taught Orientalism, that's all it took to get on. It was quite a low bar, right? And I recall, wait, you were in New York, you said earlier.
Yeah. I was doing, I was at the time when her tenure case was being challenged, I was a PhD student, originally in anthropology in her department. So yeah, I saw a lot of that too.
And so, what do you recall of this? Because her book took to task the entire renaming of Palestinian sites of memory,
Right.
cities,
Mm-hmm.
streets, boroughs, whatever the American English of borough would be, but like quarters.
Mm-hmm.
And she took to task what had gone on since even just before the Nakba. Could
Right.
you talk a bit about this kind of censorship that you've seen in the UK now, but it's also had deep roots in the US?
Yes. Yes. So I do remember that very well. The book, by the way, is Facts on the Ground, and it's based in her field work in Jerusalem, and with archaeology in particular. And it's sort of situated within science studies a little bit as well. I think one parallel between my own experience and her experience is that there was a bit of a lag between the publication of that book and the controversy. And I think that's maybe worth noting because there's, it shows that when something becomes controversial in this way, it's not necessarily just about what they wrote. It's about, how can it be kind of used politically and manipulated. And I think that, it only became controversial when she came up for tenure. So
That's
obviously
right.
whoever was targeting her was like, paying attention to that, the politics of that. And I believe it was it was a student, alumni from Barnard University, and a settler, had kind of made a case about, made a campaign about trying to, overrule, to not get her tenure.
Yeah, because the book came out in 2001 and her
Exactly.
tenure wasn't the debate around 2005, 6?
Yeah. Yes. Actually, that's almost exactly the same. I mean, in terms of the year difference, that's similar to me. My article on Bethlehem, and then four year gap. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think no, and I don't. Yeah. So it was very much kind of a good opportunity for whoever it was who had an agenda, a pro-Israeli agenda. I think it was very shocking, and on the one hand, it was shocking to see that happening. On the other hand, there was a kind of, it was encouraging, in the sense that, this is still a very fringe position. I mean, the pro-Israel, lobby. I mean, they did have some. They certainly got a lot of media attention, and they had, some influence. But I would say it's a lot. It was a lot less than we see now. And so at the end of the day, there were a lot of colleagues who ran to defend her, but she got tenure, and I think she won her case, and it was kind of a happy ending to that extent. And the university didn't, I have to wonder, these days, would Columbia actually tenure someone who came into that kind of controversy? I think that's in doubt, right? We don't, it's possible that they would not. It's quite possible. And I think we have to reckon with that. So it was astonishing to, I mean, it definitely awakened me to the sense that the stakes of this issue are so high, and so and that it poses a threat, certainly, to academic freedom at all university campuses. But there was a kind of sense of solidarity, with her, and I think with it among students and colleagues, at the university. And so I think that's a little bit different, from now on, in a bad way.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
back to that, somewhat a time when, yes, there were threats, there was persecution, but you could also there was a kind of security in knowing that there were structures in place to respect academic freedom, and I don't know that those are there anymore. And so I will say, yeah, maybe like one side of that, the unraveling of all that was when I came to the UK, in 20, and when I came under fire in 2017. I do believe that prior to that, I mean, that was another reason why it was kind of shocking to me, because there is not, prior to 2017, there is not a history of suppressing pro-Palestine speech in the UK. Certainly not in the academic context. There is no case of anyone being fired or even punished. I mean, I researched this exhaustively through FOI requests, and so I can say that with confidence.
And you were at Bristol, right?
Exactly.
And you were in good company with David Miller.
Exactly. This was before him. So it was about a year or two before. And I think it was right before he'd arrived. He was at the University of Bath then. But
That's
yes,
right.
so I think it's important to kind of, yeah, look at the timeline. I mean, this really is traceable to the IHRA definition. That's where it begins. It doesn't, I mean, some things have like a, really long history. This is a case. I mean, the suppression of free speech has a very long history in the UK, but specifically the suppression of pro-Palestine speech in academic context, no. I think I'd rightly see in the UK. In fact, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to come to the UK, because I felt like I could have a freedom to speak out on Palestine.
Hmm.
There was, Israel Apartheid Week is very popular here, was or is, I think both. But there was just a tradition of activism among students. I mean, the fact that Palestine Action, that the co-founder of Palestine Action, Huda Amori, got her start in University of Manchester, where she led very, influential and impactful campaigns. This is all before the IHRA definition. There was scope. I thought that there was some scope, and then that changed with the adoption of the IHRA definition. So, and then and perhaps the next moment in that is the kind of the normalization of just firing people, for saying the wrong thing about Palestine, which I think has been happening on both transatlantically. So yeah, I don't know that there's a kind of a hopeful story to tell. Unfortunately, probably not. But a clarifying. I suppose it's been clarifying, because we can see that there is certainly a beginning to the idea that academics should be fired, or that their careers should be impacted because they speak out for Palestine, or just because they do like rigorous scholarship on Palestine. That's been kind of internalized within the university for many, many decades. And the controversies that Nadia Abu al-Hajj has faced attest to that.
What has been your experience then since you came under attack? Did you have some backing of your colleagues, some of the student cadre?
Um, to some extent. I mean, I think people were a little bit, they didn't know what was happening. They'd not heard of the IHRA definition. They were not particularly informed about Palestine. Um, so I think people were kind of broad, I mean, to some extent supportive, but not because of Palestine. They didn't really fully grasp it. Actually, it was a Jewish colleague who originally alerted me to kind of helped me to see that this was really taking place in the context of an increasing crackdown across Europe on pro-Palestine speech, and that the kind of the use of the IHRA definition was the key to seeing that there was a campaign underway. I think what was probably two things that were really helpful for me in terms of finding solidarity. One is that I did see that actually not that many people were connecting the dots, but as I mentioned, University of Exeter, a few months after this op-ed was published about me, and I'm sure this was coordinated because there are groups that are like specialized in this kind of coordination. A colleague, well, maybe I won't mention her name because I don't have her permission, but I will say that we've written, her name is easily locatable, and we've written about this experience together in public. We have an article. So a colleague at the University of Exeter, who's a PhD student from Gaza, became subjected to just harshly anti-Semitic attacks. I mean, not harshly Islamophobic attacks, branding her as an anti-Semite. I certainly, I would, comparing my experience to hers, I would say she experienced death threats. Like the level of hate and vile that was directed towards her was quite shocking, and put my own experience into perspective. But it really helped to kind of see that we connected, and we wrote an article about kind of our intertwined experience of being targeted. She had to go through the administration, similarly to me, was not very supportive or helpful. She had people following her, and had to file a police report. And actually, a video was made by this organization. Again, it's probably better that I don't name names, but people who know these subjects will be able to know what I'm talking about. Video was made with her with a swastika on her face. Just she was giving like a speech about Palestine, and things that really put her safety at risk. And seeing that kind of targeting maybe helped me to understand. Like that helped me kind of overcome, because it was isolating. It helped me to see this is really part of a systematic project, and something that I need to shed light on. And so that was one thing that was helpful. And the other thing that was helpful was actually reaching out to a lawyer. And I certainly would recommend anyone in the, I mean, the right, finding the right lawyer, it does take a little bit of work, but I found the right lawyer. Actually, Binman's law firms, I think they deserve a shout out because they have played a leading role in the UK. Jeffrey Binman is the founder. Jeffrey Bindman is the founder of Bindman's Law. They've really perhaps are the most important law firm in the UK that defends civil liberties. Period.
Yeah.
They've defended a lot of Palestine action activists. I mean, just in an international level as well. It's really an extraordinary law firm. And so I was very fortunate in being able to connect with those lawyers, and they represented me. And that was interesting. It wasn't just about, at that point, it wasn't just about like protecting myself. It was about understanding what's happening. What is this? What are the implications of what's happening for Palestine's and for the UK, for free speech in the UK, for Palestine activists in the UK. And so I think broadening my perspective in that way was really helpful. Those two things, it was connecting with colleagues who were targeted, especially Palestinian colleagues, and learning from the law. And then, becoming a sort of, I've published subsequently quite a few articles looking at this from a legal perspective specifically, and that was incredibly helpful.
The slur of anti-Semite is something that has lost its power, we've seen over the past 2 years, but still, it's not a nice thing to be called. Absolutely. And you see this in the States, where some of the greatest outspoken critics about the genocide in Gaza, the list is long, many are Jewish. So it becomes like one of these things like water off a duck's back, and you end up even making jokes about it at a certain point. We've spoken about this even when David Miller came on the show talking about the IHRA definition. I mean, the list is ludicrous. It's complete propaganda, and it's meant to stifle any kind of criticism against what we're about to discuss now, the genocide in Gaza. You've written quite recently 2 articles that you wrote for the New Arab on forced starvation. One, to hide genocide evidence, Israel is blocking research on Gaza starvation, about the categorization of famine. And then another article that deals with famine denialism, titled Western Media's Pre-Existing Condition, Gaza Atrocity Denialism. These 2 articles are quite interesting because they get at, again, a cousin debate that's happening. People were arguing about is there not famine, and similarly, is there not genocide? And as you know, we've had a lot of genocide experts on the show, and there was a turn. And the consensus turned earlier this year, where genocide experts across the world are pretty much mostly in agreement that there is a genocide taking place in Gaza. Similar to famine, this debate is still ongoing. Can you talk a bit about this? We've highlighted on the show some of the grotesque things that some of these gender critical feminists have written, like they don't need food. They need a treadmill. They're obese. They don't need food. They need more exercise. They look pretty fat to me, like really grotesque things to say. And in fact, the other day, when speaking with Alex Duval, he mentioned something that I thought a lot about as I go through the edits and I'm listening again and I'm thinking, he started to talk about the photography that was being used during the Holocaust, and most especially, he noted the Warsaw Ghetto photography. So I went ahead, while I was editing and listening to him, I went and found the photography. And what he says is spot on. There are photos of the upper class, and they look better fed. They look wealthier. That's the nature of class. And you see the poor Jews in the ghetto. You can see class right there. But then he notes how these photos were weaponized to turn the classes against each other, where, well, look at those more corpulent individuals. They're the ones stealing the food from those in that photo who are not. And I was thinking a lot about this past week, actually, even today, because the kind of weaponization of evidence, it's its own Darvo, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. Yes, that's an excellent question. And I would definitely recommend to listeners to check out that interview, by the way, with Alex Duval, which I agree was quite brilliant. Yes, so maybe before I answer that question directly, it'd be helpful to kind of give a little trajectory of what happened after I published this book, because the book came out, Erasing Palestine, that we've been discussing so far, came out in July 2023. So 3 months before October 7. And at that point, I guess I kind of expected I would just go on to my next project, but that didn't quite happen. Because of the genocide in Gaza. I became connected with a family in Gaza, actually, that has definitely shaped my research since in my writing. I have connected with this family that I kind of really, I basically have been every single day since what was it, February 2024. I've been in touch with this family in Gaza, a really extraordinary family that I've written a little bit about, but mostly actually I've not so much written about them as published their works. Lou Jane in particular is a really extraordinary writer whose work has appeared. I've worked to translate her work into English with my friends in Gaza, in The Nation, Al Jazeera, New Lines. You could find her work everywhere, and I'm in the process of writing more with them and about them. But anyway, the point is that I had a kind of obligation emotionally to myself, to them, to Palestine, to do my part in terms of documenting the genocide and what was being experienced. And I remember there was one very particular moment. I should also add that this family, again, I think anyone who follows my work will learn more about them. But this family is one of the captain, one Asa, one of my friends, actually returned to Gaza by choice after October 7, because he had skills that could be helpful, and so he's a humanitarian worker there, essentially, saving lives, and they're in a much better position than the average Palestinian in Gaza. They have been intense for some of their displacements. I mean, like all of everyone in Gaza, they've been displaced at least 10 or 12 times and suffered the death of family members and so on. But, relatively speaking, they are better off economically. But there's just one moment, maybe about, would it have been 8 months ago or so, when Lana, one of my friends, just collapsed suddenly. While she was in the middle of performing a medical procedure. She is herself a doctor, and she had never told me, that she was suffering that level of exhaustion, and it was very shocking to me, because I always kind of consoled myself by thinking, well, I understand there's a genocide happening in Gaza, but they're better off than most. But then it was very clear that, like, it's affecting literally everyone. The most privileged do not have enough, and even if they have enough money, they just can't get food. And it was a very kind of terrifying moment that awakened a lot in me. And I began, so yes, I think you were framing your question in terms of genocide, the kind of growing consensus around the genocide in Gaza, which I think a lot of really perceptive people kind of understood from the beginning, given the Nakba, given the history of displacement. I mean, I think it became clear very early on that what was happening was genocidal in nature. Um, but at the same time, I think one angle that has perhaps been not quite as explored as it should be, is the role that starvation plays in that genocide. At this point, according to most of the experts that I've been speaking with, there's about an even breakdown between people who have been died from what could be called a trauma-related injury, in the sense of, like, military action, strikes, weapons, and people who have either starved to death or died from illnesses contracted due to their starvation. So the death count is equal. It's not that one is more evil than the other, but I tend to feel like the starvation angle of that does not get just quite the attention it deserves, especially considering that while the weaponization of food has a very long history, Israel's particular the particular way in which this is playing out in Gaza is quite extraordinary. I mean, I think Alex DeWall said in an interview, I think it was with Democracy Now, that he has never seen anything like this kind of minutely engineered forced starvation since World War II. And of course, that doesn't mean that there haven't been politically induced famines since then in other places. There are plenty of them, and Alex DeWall has written quite comprehensively about them. But the point is just like the kind of the carefulness, the strategy and the planning that has gone behind the starvation of Gaza. It's really terrifying, and it really, I don't think that there could ever be too much attention on that. And actually, before I continue my comments, I just want to read a quote here from a book that I'm currently reading. It's about the Holodomor in Ukraine during 1931 and 1932. And there's this one quote that I think was so representative of what you were also getting at, this like famine denialism and how it operates. So this is from a New York Times journalist in 1933 who had visited Ukraine, and it was actually played a very big role in denying the famine at that point. So the New York Times, by the way, as a side note, they have a very bad history on all kinds of famine denialism. So this is the quote that he published in the New York Times, 1933. And while around 5 million Ukrainians were starving to death, he says, there's no actual starvation or deaths from starvation, but there is widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition. I thought that was such a telling quote because mortality from diseases due to malnutrition is exactly starvation. It is exactly that. And yet there's, so many world powers and media sources throughout history have invested so much effort in trying to pretend like it's not doesn't work that way. But I think, it's particularly, just by reading the work of Alex DeWall or many other scholars of famine, anyone familiar with Holocaust history will know that the vast majority, something like 90 into the 90% of, actually probably more than that, maybe 95 or more percent of Jews who died in the Holocaust, it died from starvation. And not only that, but they died from diseases associated with malnutrition. It wasn't that, their bodies actually withered away into nothing. That's not how it works. It's that the lack of food makes people vulnerable to diseases, such that, say, if you get a cold, well, then that cold becomes pneumonia, and your immune system cannot resist that, and you die. And I think that the reason why that's kind of important to understand when we're talking about assessing genocide is that kind of structure of death, just like Alex DeWall was saying, it leads people to think that there's no perpetrator, that it's just some kind of like logical thing, just natural thing that happens to the body. And I saw, I've seen that happen in the case of Gaza, but also it's just so entrenched in the way we think about starvation, and it's deeply problematic. And there's this tendency, to take indirect deaths or deaths by malnutrition as somehow not being caused by the perpetrator of the genocide. And I think, and then there's that's been true actually for probably a century of international law. Even the Holocaust, no one was actually charged with the starvation crime, and since then, actually there's one case in the International Criminal Court of someone being charged with a starvation crime. And that is actually Benjamin Netanyahu and, well, Yoav Galan, I guess we could call it too. So that's interesting, that for the first time in history, really, like even in the case of Sudan, there were no Bashir was not charged with starvation. There's no precedent. So one would hope that that's kind of a good thing, at least that the International Criminal Court did, was highlight that as kind of the core of their genocidal logic. At the same time, unfortunately, we see that those arrest warrants have yet to be really enforced. But it was, I think, an important moment, which unfortunately is not getting the traction it deserves. But that's kind of where I am currently in trying to, so not just talk about the genocide in Gaza, which is extremely important, but specifically to highlight how starvation as a weapon makes that genocide possible and enables the rest of the world, particularly states, complicit states, to look away, right? So Israel can always kind of slightly allow a few more trucks in and then try to deny a famine. And it's just the mechanisms there, I think, are really important to attend to. So yeah, so that's where my energy is at the moment.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. And the other thing about starvation, as I mentioned to Alex, there's a lot of scholarship about how the famine of Ethiopia and starvation itself is depoliticized because it's made as if it were a forest fire. It just happened.
Exactly.
We don't know who did it. It's over. Who knows?
Yes.
How odd.
Exactly.
And I think this is a huge problem where it comes to our media because they are the worst at covering this.
Completely.
And starvation is just one of those things that happens because you remember what just recently, I mean, this pop-up organization from the US, and it's completely Zionist organization, that now they're going to solve the problem, but they were part of the problem. In fact, they were giving information to the IDF as to where people were so people could just shoot off, just pick off people with sniper fire. How grotesque does it have to get for people to wake up to the cruelty of this? And so you have the famine being weaponized as target practice, literally. Yeah.
You're thinking of the GHF?
Yep, the GHF.
That's what I meant by saying that I think Israel, I think for anyone who cares about starvation anywhere, they need to be paying attention to what was happening in Gaza, because that's just beyond the pale of what humanity has come to so far. I mean, that was really, yeah, it absolutely is. Let's hopefully it's being dismantled, not to be seen again. But I think that is a new moment in humanitarian the kind of the genocidal state's use of the kind of the language of humanitarianism, basically to kill people. I think the big difference between the GHF and, say, traditional humanitarian aid distribution is that it required the best practice. I think UNRWA knows this, United Nations knows this. One reason why they've been able to effectively address famines is that they bring food to where people are, right? But the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation required people to go to the most dangerous places and then just killed them. And also, interestingly, the food supplies that they provided were very low in nutrition, and that's still happening in Gaza, by the way. That should be said. Even though the GHF has been dismantled, there are a lot of reports about junk food only being allowed into Gaza. So not nutritious fruit and vegetables, not grains to make bread. Well, the food that's getting in is like high in fat and sugar. And that's been described as a kind of genocidal, approach as well. It's a continuation, at least. But yeah, I think Israel is really kind of at the cutting edge of using starvation as a weapon of war. They have quite a few tactics that, unfortunately, a lot of other dictators and perpetrators of genocide are learning from. Yeah.
And recently as well, I was speaking with someone over the summer about the Holodomor, who I believe has Stalinist inclinations, and she was in denial of it, saying that the numbers were exaggerated. And I, when you're talking to someone and you're alone in the room and you find yourself looking over your shoulder, it was like one of those. And I'm like, oh my God, I lost words at that point because I have a very low tolerance for denialism, reality denialism. But I would say, Rebecca, that this is part of our current social process, unfortunately. We're living in an era of complete denialism. And I think, in a way, there's been a lot of political agendas. Identity politics feeds into that perfectly. Don't keep your eye on the ball. Let's talk about this completely frivolous affair that has nothing to do with workers' rights, housing, food on the table, but how you see me. Please see me how I see me, and reiterate the words I'm telling you to say about me. And I think that's played a huge part in all of what we're talking about. We've not been paying attention to the important things. Governments have been trespassing upon civil liberties and freedom of expression or First Amendment rights in the States, because it's all about curating these identities. Meanwhile, we have a reality at our feet. And I had Reem Al-Salam on the show recently, and she's very maligned by the gender activists because she's like, no, women and girls need their spaces. And she gave very good reasoning for that, as many people would agree. And it's amazing to me how the same people can see the genocide on the ground, because a lot of people who are criticizing the genocide are the people whom I have heretofore criticized about what I call fairy dust identity politics. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the feminists that have been fighting the identity wars, they're the ones saying to get a treadmill. So we've got this complete disconnect politically. Right. During lockdown, I saw a lot of things come together. And I started to note how Tucker Carlson was not the right winger people made him out to be. He was the only one in legacy media, to my mind, even till now, the only one who spoke outrightly and constantly about class issues and poverty. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, the nation, we're running pieces about how important it is for us to lock down. Mm-hmm. Oh my God. And even the more like Jacobin type of publications. And so I think we're in this moment of the more information we have, and we have it, and people have mobile phones if they can't have a computer to verify the information. What do you think is driving, aside from Zionism, driving the denialism of both starvation and the genocide?
Gosh, such a large question. I suppose, especially while you were speaking, and I was thinking that this targeting of speech, it's harmful in itself, I think we could say, because, it silences people's points of view, but it's such a distraction. And maybe that's part of it. It functions very well as a distraction from the material inequalities that are becoming increasingly entrenched. And it's a convenient kind of thing to focus on that's kind of easier, than other kinds of political action. So I guess that's part of the answer. I'm not sure I have a complete answer, though. It's a good question.
I often think about this because obviously there's a huge strain of Zionism amongst the denialism that's ongoing. Mm-hmm. And in the UK, for instance, I still can't put my finger as to why so many people who consider themselves on the left are supporting this, or even will say there are some very nice people I work with and speak to, and but I don't agree with you about Israel. I think Israel has the right to exist and things like that. And I'm thinking, okay, like I'm not going to be mean to you for having those thoughts, but these are people who have fought for material reality. Now, obviously, they've come on the side of there's no such thing as the female penis. Okay. But why can't you see that those people are starving? And when I saw, oh my God, if I see one more tweet about Pollywood, I'm just like, do you think they have Pollywood? Do you think it's not even on the level of that? They don't have food, much less any films that would be made from mobile phones at best.
Well, in that case, I think it's simply racism. I mean, I think that for me, that explains a lot. And unfortunately, it just shows like that to me has been one of the big lessons of the Gaza genocide. It's just that racism is not something that we've overcome as a society or as a world. That's my thought.
But what do we do? Because, you and I we were in New York at around the same time then. Mm-hmm. And what happens to the Adorno pondering of, can there be poetry after Auschwitz? I am at a deeper level now, and I keep thinking of Adorno, but think of Adorno a lot. I want to write about him actually soon, because I think the question isn't anymore. It's not on the level of having truth and reconciliation, let's say, hearings. We know who's guilty in Israel. Right. Will the people who've been sending the arms over, including from our government, be held to account? That's another question. Mm-hmm. What about all these people on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, who are cheerleading genocide? That's a next level thing that we never saw historically. We didn't see Germans like, put those people in those train cars. Yeah, we didn't see that. We didn't have any kind of reference like we do today. Mm-hmm. How do we live in a world where a large part of our fellow humans, especially in the West, because non-West, the masses know that Israel's a genocidal state. It's only in the West where there's this tug and push and pull on the truth. how can we reconcile this? Because in a way, I don't know if we can have a Nuremberg for these people,
Mhm.
but what on earth to do with people who, like Douglas Murray, we've now found out he was a complete fraud. He's not even a journalist. He's been paid by Israel to
Oh, wow.
pimp out Hasbara. What do we do with the likes of people like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge. I guess in terms of understanding how this is even possible, that so many people could become cheerleaders to genocide. For me, also, I think part of it has to do with the way the Holocaust has been weaponized, and certainly, yeah, both in the Europe and in the U.S. I mean, it shows, that there was this very since the 19 I should say it's interesting that, after the Holocaust, it was not something that people wanted to talk about. Primo Levi's account of living in Auschwitz was rejected by a publisher because no one wanted to read about it. But after a few decades, after the perpetrators were mostly not as vulnerable, after the stakes were not as high politically, during the 1980s, the Holocaust became this kind of cornerstone of, national memory in both Europe and the U.S. And I think it was a very important part of the U.S.'s sense of itself, as this kind of savior, right, of the
That's right.
world, because it ended the Holocaust. And this is, yeah, it has a very distinct genealogy and very well fits with a kind of U.S. nationalist narrative that justifies all the wars that are happening now. And then that kind of fed into the educational system. And there was this idea that, we can kind of create a world where never again, which has been proven untrue so many times. But I think, and that's, I think, prevented people from seeing, to some extent, that Israel is also capable of committing genocide. And so it's also a bit generational. I mean, not entirely, but I think a lot of the people that you're talking about are kind of a little bit of an older generation. They've sort of internalized these kind of state-based nationalist Holocaust memories. And they just can't see beyond them. So in that sense, I think we could be a bit hopeful because I don't think the poll shows such a very, very sharp division in terms of younger generations, right? Who are very overwhelmingly uh, in favor of calling out the genocide in Gaza. I think if they were in charge right now, it wouldn't have happened, right? So in that sense, I mean, I'm sure new problems are going to come, but in that sense, I think there's a bit of hope.
Including on the right. It's really surprising to see. I follow Candace Owens, although I don't
Mhm.
think she's that right, actually. I mean, that far
Uh,
right or anything like that. And it's interesting to see the fragmentation of Ben Shapiro and to
uh-huh.
watch the politics of the 20, 30-ish generations and how they're looking at things. I just
Right.
love Candace Owens because even if I think she's wrong about Brigitte Macron, I think she's right about the rest of that very story because she looks at the background of how he was handled just in a similar
Uh-huh.
way that Obama was. Both men were handled by kingmakers and put into office, which
Mhm.
raises serious questions for our democracies as well, by the way. Because
For sure.
meanwhile, we talk about campaign finance reform back home, we should be talking about also the kind of transparency that needs to happen. And what is the biggest irony in the world? We've got people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. I never thought I'd love that woman. She's calling out the genocide. She's calling for transparency over the files of
Epstein.
Jeffrey Epstein files. It's amazing to see where the right and the left have no more sense.
Right.
It's almost like the magic 8 ball, right?
That's true. Yeah, yeah. I think the distinction is kind of, especially in the United States, at least. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm hopeful that there's a new left is coming in the UK, with the Green Party and so on. We'll see. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the Democratic Party is certainly not doesn't have any could not be called the left in any reasonable sense anymore.
In your work on anti Semitism, I wanted to know if you could opine a bit about what has happened with Jeremy Corbyn, because I
Mm.
found that really heartbreaking what
Hmm.
happened within his own party.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, perhaps you could see it as a kind of the story of the decline of the Labour Party in general, because if we look at where they are now, I mean, it's really a right-wing party, and it's a party that, that prescribe Palestine Action as a terrorist group. It's a party that has actually talked about making chants for Palestine illegal. That comes from Keir Starmer. Their media, he's quoted as saying that he thinks that chants should at least be there should be government pressure to prevent people from doing that. They've just stood on the side of genocide in so many different ways, and that party that's in power now was the party that made every effort to make it impossible for Jeremy Corbyn to ever be prime minister. He was, I suppose that's also contributed to some extent to the kind of normalization of the IHRA definition, to go back to the beginning of our conversation. Because when he was elected, Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party. He came under extraordinary pressure to adopt this definition. And again, remember, we shouldn't forget that this was never the IHRA definition was never like in its original formulation. No one said that should be something to be adopted by a political party. I think that in itself is a bit it's a strange idea. And then the adoption of that definition became the basis of expelling mostly Jewish members. Actually, mostly Jewish pro-Palestine members were expelled from the party because they were seen to criticize Zionism, or to not support the right of Israel to exist, to criticize Israel as a racist endeavor. And yeah, so he was put in a very difficult position. I mean, obviously, a leader of a party has a lot of power, but they don't have the power can be very limited, and they can be undermined. And I think Jeremy Corbyn was definitely undermined. Um, and after that, I mean, after he was ceased to be the leader, I think the Labour Party itself really lost its function. I mean, it doesn't in any way. There's almost nothing of it really that is can be seen as kind of makes it a legitimate claim heir to the left. It's lost. Like that's a history of 100 years of having a workers' party was always something that I was happy that the UK had, but I don't think that's the situation anymore. And there's new realignments are happening. Jeremy Corbyn now has this what's called the Your Party, which is not affiliated with Labour or any other leftist group, and that they've gotten pretty sizable numbers of members. And then if you combine those numbers that the Jeremy Corbyn's independent group, and Zara Sultana is another, his co-founder, those numbers, if you combine them with the Green Party numbers, which are extraordinary, I mean, they've experienced an extraordinary surge of popularity. And I personally had never thought of myself as being green until the latest leadership campaign, where they came out as being very, very outspoken in Palestine. They were the first party in the UK to describe Israel's actions as a genocide. They voted to prescribe the IDF as a terrorist organization. I mean, I think they've had a lot of really kind of leading positions on this topic. If you combine those two numbers, again, it's two separate groups, but I think you have a real chance of a leftist government in the near future in the UK. Of course, there are other factors too, but I have to hope for something. So,
where do you see this situation now of the genocide that's taking place? What do you see as the solution at this point? Because what I'm seeing, at least by these moronic appointments of Tony Blair and Kushner, is a disaster on the horizon. It's just replacing one Titanic with another leaky ship.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is that there isn't really a solution. I think it's only just to continue the struggle and to stand in solidarity with Palestinians who are continuing the struggle. And I mean that's the remarkable thing, that many of them, I mean, some have left, and I'm sure many would leave Gaza if given the chance. But there are also many, I am certain, including my friends there. I'm certain they wouldn't. I know that, and they've committed their lives to the struggle of their people and of future generations. And so I guess, unfortunately, I think that's the only answer. Like, it's a lifelong, it's beyond our lives, and we have to be willing to commit ourselves to that cause, and even when there isn't a kind of short-term solution. So, but continuing to press our leaders, obviously, that never stops. Continuing with boycotts, and yeah, right now you're right. I mean, it's not peace in Gaza. We can see that the land is kind of gradually still being confiscated by Israel. And again, as I mentioned, the aid is not getting in anything like the proportion it should be. But Palestinians are not going to give up, so we can't either.